Next up, we are going to have a little, let's call it a fireside chat with Mr. Ryan Norbauer. I know he's deep in conversation. Very shortly, we're going to have a nice fireside chat about life, keyboards, maybe things that help stabilize our lives. There's a variety of things. Everyone, give it a round of applause for Mr. Ryan Norbauer, please. And if you have any questions for Mr. Ryan Norbauer, please save them. We're going to do a quick 20, 25 minutes. It's a few talking points, and then we'll be opening up the floor to any questions the audience might have. Ryan, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you? I have a very bright green light in my eyes. So
that's wonderful.
I apologize for squinting.
So let's start off. Actually, there was a question that was specifically requested that I ask you. We're going to start with a very simple question. Mr. Ryan Norbauer, if you could travel anywhere in the past or the future to meet someone and you could only bring one gift, who would that individual be and what would you bring them?
That is a bizarrely specific question. I don't know. I think I would, maybe I would, does this have to be real future? I guess if it's the future, it's imaginary, so it doesn't matter. I think I would go meet my hero, Captain Picard, in the future. I can't imagine what I would possibly bring him that would be of any consequence. But I used to make prop replicas for Roddenberry Entertainment. So, Gene Roddenberry is the guy who created Star Trek. And because I love Captain Picard so much, I made a bunch of Captain Picard-related props. And there's one thing that he just it's a crystal that he holds in his hand and he plays around with in a lot of episodes. I would maybe bring him that as a manifestation of how much I cared about his character and how much of an influence it had on me as a kid.
So this would be Picard post-TNG pre-movies?
Sure. Yeah, let's say so. Yeah.
Because I think bringing that to Academy Cadet Picard might be a little confusing.
That would be very confusing
for the young ensign. Thank you for that. That was very enlightening. So I actually have a question, and it's just kind of funny because the Merriam-Webster word of the day is jurisprudence, which refers to laws and the philosophy of laws. And that got me thinking, Ryan, you're known for a lot of your designs, whether it's the Heavy Grail, Norba Force, Norba Touch, names I know you're not the biggest fans of but have accepted, and soon to be Seneca. When you're working on a design, are there any design laws or restraints or anything that you put yourself in to build your design?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I often talk about my being inspired by retro-futurist shapes. So I really want something that is evocative of our past visions of what the future would look like. And there's a certain design language that's associated with that, much of which I get from Star Trek The Next Generation. I really love the design of Epcot Center in Florida from the 1980s. There are all these kind of particular shapes and forms that are evocative of that idea. So I always want some element of that in my designs. But there's also more practical things too. So that first keyboard that I made for the Nova Touch, the first housing I made for the Nova Touch keyboard, it had a seam around the sides, right? Which was and in many ways still is kind of the standard approach. You have two halves that go together, screw together, and there's a visible seam somewhere along the side of the housing. For some reason that always bothered me. And so subsequent to that design, I moved the seam to around the back where it's not visible during normal typing. So I use rear cover plates as I do on the Norba Force keyboard. And on the Seneca, I've done that, but I've also removed the visible fasteners. So there's a rear cover plate on it, but you can't quite tell from the outside of the keyboard how it's attached, right? And so I just want to make the design language as simple and in a way that reads visually very easily. And so the fewer functional features I can hide, the more I like it. So no screws, no seams, that kind of thing is very important to me because it has that sort of sleek, futurist quality about it. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it's very, very enlightening. which helps bring transition us to the Seneca. A lot of people have heard the name, heard your association with it, but for those who may not be in the know, what is the Seneca and what can maybe people expect from the Seneca?
So, I mean, it's an electrocapacitive keyboard, in short. So it has a Topra-like quality to it. And it has that sort of inherent internal dampening that comes from rubber domes. But it is my attempt of taking that sort of basic framework in the enthusiast community and building every element of a keyboard from scratch, down to literally the screws, every single gasket and element, the switch plate. They're all custom designed by me from scratch, taking into account what the enthusiast community has learned over the years makes a keyboard good. So, Topra keyboards are amazing, but they're sort of accidentally good, right? I think they're originally designed for durability and for industrial use. And the approach that was taken by the engineers when the Switch was created in, I guess, the 70s, I think it was the 70s. In any case, the approach just happened to be one that is very acoustically and tactily satisfying, and therefore became adopted by the enthusiast community because we just liked it. But it wasn't created with any knowledge of what the enthusiast community cares about, and the things that we've learned since then make for a satisfying typing experience. So my idea was, let's have a keyboard where it's just like an intellectual exercise in throwing aside all concerns about costs and making everything as perfect as we possibly can, right? So it's like, I sometimes have been describing it as engineering from first principles for a keyboard. So I stepped back and I was like, what are the things that I have as design objectives, and how can we make them, or what would make a keyboard really good? And let's see if we can solve them without worrying about how hard that would be or how expensive. Just because that's the only thing that would be interesting to me at this point. I've made aftermarket housings for all the keyboards that I'm interested in. It was just the next interesting thing. So, for example, like stabilizers, inherently, as we all know in the enthusiast community, the way to make them good is, or at least the ones that exist, is to inject a high viscosity lubricant in, right? And so some amount of tuning is required, and it's because it relies on the bulk volume of the material can be displaced over time, and you may have to redo, some maintenance is required. And something about that has always just like gnawed at me. It seemed like there should be a better solution to having stabilizers that don't rattle and that don't require this. Hold it closer. Sorry. That don't require this extreme amount of maintenance and just a suboptimal solution. So I worked on that problem for a long time, and we do have a solution that is a fundamentally different architecture to stabilizing that doesn't require high viscosity lubricant to dampen the sound, right, or to dissipate the sound. And that is true of every single corner of this keyboard. So there are things like, for example, the compression of a coil, a Topra coil against the PCB, causes a little bit of a sound that's sometimes referred to as spring crunch. So in order to eliminate that, I've added this sort of very microscopic dampening layer between the PCB and the coils to dissipate that sound. But in order to do that, I've had to, invent well, first of all, in order to even make a capacitive keyboard, I had to make my own PCB and firmware for it. But the additional challenge of dampening that sound required increasing the sensitivity and the gain of the PCB so that it could detect those key presses through a thicker layer, right? And there's things like that at every corner of the keyboard where I'm like, okay, I know that this is going to be really hard. It's going to be a lot more work than just, making a clone of Topra or something like that. I'm trying to do something that is vaguely inspired by things that have come before, but is like a fundamental reinvention. So that's the premise of the project.
Wow, that was very insightful and very detailed. Thank you so much. Something interesting that you said that I noticed was, which I think a lot of people can agree with to a degree, which is Topra was accidentally good. Because a lot of people who enjoy Topra kind of found it on accident. If we look at if we look at the early days of the hobby, 2009 through 2013, Topra wasn't even considered like a mechanical keyboard.
It's debatable, yeah.
Which is debatable even to this day. So when you first discovered Topra, did it have properties you were seeking, or did it just happen to fall in your lap and you realized, oh, this is the best I've tried so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think I went through a path that is similar to a lot of people who end up at Topra or who find out about mechanical keyboards in general, which is when I first learned that there was an enthusiast community around mechanical keyboards, I got very excited because I was like, oh, this reminds me of the keyboards I loved when I was growing up, learning to program on an Apple IIe or the IBM PS2, these very clacky, loud, very specific sounding keyboards. And so I thought what I would want when I heard about this was, oh, I want Cherry MX Blue switches because they're going to be really loud and kind of nostalgic and remind me of those keyboards. And I experimented with a lot of keyboards. Well, there weren't actually that many switches at the time, but I tried all the ones that were available, even doing things like spring swapping and whatever mods were available. I think I settled on liking, it was like some modified version of a brown switch, right? And I settled on that for quite some time, and I was very excited about just the idea of keyboards. I got very engaged in Geek Hack, and I made a Star Trek-inspired keycap set and all of this. But then somehow I just kept reading little mentions of Topra and its Japanese origins and how it was kind of like, there's always this contingent of people, at least at the time, who was like, thought of themselves as the more refined sensibility, we're like, okay, sure, the Cherry MX stuff is fun, but eventually you'll graduate up to the more expensive, Topra keyboard. And I'm like, it is a little flaw in my personality that stuff like that, I'm like, oh, I want to try that. That's what I want. I want to try the most expensive thing. And so with some difficulty, I managed to obtain a 30-gram dome weight keyboard, Topra board from Japan, and I swapped the domes into a standard one because I knew that I like light switches. And something about that unusual, like deep, thocky sound really, really did it for me. But it was hard. It was hard back in those days you couldn't, as I say, you couldn't get a 30-gram dome anywhere in the United States. And in fact, I couldn't even find a seller in Japan that would ship it to me. I had to get a friend who was in Japan visiting his fiancée to pick it up for me and bring it back. Things are much better now, but the Topra has many merits as a company, but they're still not super engaged with the enthusiast community, and so I kind of I wanted to make something that was a little bit more informed by what enthusiasts say that they're into. So for example, the really dampening is an important part of the sort of the ethos of the Seneca, right? And so, for example, the switch plate is made of very thick brass. It's like almost 4 millimeters thick, which is much, because my view is that there's two altering philosophies of where you put dampening in a keyboard. In a Cherry MX board, the dampening can come from the inherent flex of the materials. I think a really good Cherry MX board has a very flexy plate. That's my sort of idea of the optimal Cherry situation, because that's where the dampening comes from. Because the switches themselves are rigid. There are no flexible, really, for the most part, there aren't flexible elements in Cherry MX switches other than the little downstroke dampening on a silent red switch, for example. But in the capacitive world, I believe that you should have a rigid skeleton, but because the dampening comes from the switches itself. So you have this very flexible, gummy element of the dome that is what absorbs the sound, the sort of the impact of the downstroke, right? In a way that the flexible plates can do on a Cherry side. And so my idea was just lean as far into that as possible to have things that dampen unwanted sounds. And brass is a uniquely good material for absorbing high-pitched internal reflections. Brass switch plate is, especially a milled one, not one using sheet metal fabrication techniques, it's much more expensive. And I had hoped I could get away with an aluminum or a sheet metal plate, but the brass sounds so much better that I just okay, this is what we have to do. Because that's kind of the philosophy of this project is, fuck the costs, we do what's good. Incidentally, that's why it's so expensive, right? And so there are a lot of elements that I've incorporated through the board that, bring enthusiast philosophies to it. So every single interface, almost every single interface between a hard, flat, planar surface is gasketed. So there's a little bit of tactile absorption, but also everything is perfectly acoustically sealed. So even the individual switch housings, right, which pop into the plate, they don't. Again, it's an improvement over Topra that mine don't pop in. They're actually held under preload, where they're sort of squished between the dome on the back, and there's a gasket around every single switch, right? Which is a mod that some enthusiasts will do now on Topra boards, but it's actually overmolded in our switch. So the gasket is part of the switch, in the same way that the little rubber dampening elements are on a Cherry MX Silent Red slider. Anyway, sorry, I kind of forgot the original question, but
it's all good. That was very detailed, of course. It's interesting you discuss the different parts of the switch, because for a lot of people, when you ask them what constitutes a Topra switch, you get a lot of answers, right?
Sure.
Some say it's everything from the PCB to the keycap. Some will say it's just the plunger, dome, and spring. Some will say the plate is a part of the switch because of how it mounts on. So it sounds like for the Seneca, the revised switch itself is an all-encompassing build of the board, essentially, from PCB, gasket, spring, dome, plates, slider.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been thinking of this as like what I'm building is a switch platform, right? And so it's a little hard with a capacitive board to exactly identify what the switch is, you know? It's a system, and especially when it comes to acoustics, everything interacts. So I don't know, is the switch plate part of the switch? In a sense it is, if it has such a huge impact on the subjective experience of the board. But you know, there's a core architecture that will define, I think, the acoustics and tactile profile of what I'm making, namely the housing and the slider and the dome. And those are not intended to be a copy of Topra, they're just sort of loosely inspired by it. They are, you know, it sounds and feels different because there are mechanical differences between them. But nevertheless, the switch per se is all part of that system, and this is why it has taken me, depending on how you count, between 5 and 10 years to develop this project. Is you have to make every single component in order to do this. It's not like a Cherry board where you can just sort of PCB and swap out the switches, so all you need to do is make a switch. You have to make the stack from top to bottom. And I will definitely do different boards that have different acoustic signatures. So for example, I've already produced some Senecas as tests where everything is polycarbonate. So the switch plate is polycarbonate, the housing, the rear cover plate, everything other than the domes and switches themselves are polycarbonate. And it has a radically different sound. It's much more clacky, as you'd expect, right? And eventually we'll probably do, our next thing will be a sort of HHKB form factor layout. But that board will also sound radically different. We might do something like carbon fiber, forged carbon fiber for the housing, so that it's super light. But we'll also do an injection molded plate like I did on the Heavy Grail. And that, I'm sure, will sound and feel totally different than the Seneca. So this is why I'm excited about this new switch platform project, is it gives me so many more creative possibilities than I had before. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. Thinking of electrical passive as a switch platform, I think, is definitely the next jump on how people view electric passive boards, because right now it's more of a mishmash of components people are customizing, changing out.
That's something that's been really great recently, right? Topra has been getting some love, and you can buy so many. You can buy domes, you can buy, all of the Deskies stuff, and it's very exciting time actually now for capacitive.
Yeah, Topra's more alive than it's ever been, which is really great for the community. I'm sure it's great for the HHKB guys. But something that you said also really caught my eye, which is you want a board that sounds good, and making a board with engineering principles first. Is there a way to quantify what you're looking for in the sound?
No, it's extremely maddening because I work with these really brilliant mechanical engineers in Denmark who've been helping me optimize all of the aspects of the keyboard that are way above my head in terms of mechanical engineering ability. And they do all these very sophisticated simulations, and they have a really rigorous mental framework for understanding kinematics and mechanical parts, but they just don't have the keyboard enthusiast sensibility about what sounds good. So I can send them, I'll have a part in a test fixture, like a prototype stabilizer, and I'll be like, this thing is making a horrible sound. And I'll send it to them, and they'll be like, I can't hear it. And I'll send them two. I'll send them one where I've implemented a fix where the sound is gone. On the other side, it's a sound that drives me crazy, and they're like, I can't hear the difference. I don't know how to test whether my fix is working because I can't hear it, right? It's for better or worse, it's a sensibility you kind of get having come to meetups and listen to a bunch of keyboards, that you become sensitive to things that are somewhat subjective, but nevertheless the keyboard community as a whole doesn't like, right? And that's actually one of the things that makes this really challenging is I've not yet discovered a way to quantify in a rigorous scientific way, we've solved, this is a good sounding switch, here's what waveform looks like in software or something. It's really a very practical, hands-on tinkering process. You try something, you see what it sounds like, you try it, and you learn to tell the differences. But even capturing it on microphone is really hard. I recently filmed a couple of typing tests for the Seneca, and they sound like really high-end, good, lubed Topra boards if you do it, if you look at them on YouTube. But it still doesn't, to my view, accurately characterize what it sounds like in a room. You can put a microphone really close on a keyboard and you can get a lot of sounds that you don't hear in reality. But then if you pull it way back, it just sounds really silent. Acoustics are very hard to. It's a very hand wavy thing in the world of keyboards. Still, I would love it if somebody could help us develop some kind of rigorous framework for analyzing this stuff. But I'm not there yet.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the permanent challenges of the keyboard community, whether it's electrocapacitive or MX or whatever other, or even Alps sound. The subjectivity of what's good, what's bad.
Force curves are the same way. You can't just target. There are elements about the experience of typing on a switch that you just can't perfectly capture with the force curve.
Yeah, that's true. I'm someone who has a force curve machine myself. I used to regularly produce force curve graphs for people. And there's really two problems. One, as you mentioned, force curve graphs don't very accurately represent feeling, as we are but flesh and blood. Our fingers are not perfect, unfortunately. And two, I guess it's less of a surprise, but a lot of people just don't know how to read force curve graphs, or at least...
Sure, it's not super intuitive.
It's not very intuitive at all, because our fingers are greatest at detecting changes in pressure as opposed to small, constant changes. If it's a big, that's why a lot of people, of course, like big tactility. We feel that change in acceleration, which, if anyone's curious, what you feel in a tactile switch is actually a change in acceleration, and that, I guess, releases dopamines in your brain because you like tactile switches. But that's what it comes down to. But yeah, I've always had trouble with trying to explain people, this is the quantitative measurement, but it doesn't necessarily reflect your subjective reality. Because different people, for example, even have, I've had guitarists type on my keyboards and they'll tell me something different because they have different cal sizes on their fingers compared to a pianist, compared to even different string instrument players. And they're like, no, this feels way better. This feels way better. I'm like, why is it so different? And I realize, they feel differently because their fingers are all different.
And it's always very interesting to notice how much the sound actually influences your perception of the tactility, right? It's a very subtle thing that you don't really exactly know is happening. But it is my theory, I'm not saying that I've fully tested this, but you can have switches that have exactly the same force curve and feel exactly the same, but if they have a different sound,
Yes, sound is a tremendous part of our experience, and it's almost the same way for a lot of people. I think it's the same thing about food and smells. Something could taste amazing, but if it doesn't smell, if the smell doesn't match the taste, your brain has that cognitive dissonance almost, where it's like, nope, not good. This didn't match up. And I think for a lot of people, at least, I'm going to comment on a lot of the boards here. A lot of people, I feel like, chase sound more so than they chase a good feel, because, like you said, it's almost like the sound will justify any kind of feel that they feel. If it just sounds good enough, it doesn't need to be necessarily a good switch, whatever subjective good that is.
I think taste and smell is the perfect analogy, right? Because it's like, you would think that 90% of your perception comes from the actual taste buds, but it's actually the other way around, right? And it's kind of the same way with switches. You would think that most of it comes from the actual, what your fingers experience, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's the other way around. Yeah.
You know, I think it'd be a great experiment in the future to get people to do typing tests, but give them like noise canceling headphones and just have them like rate and at least try to rate switches based on.
Yeah, that would be a really good way to do it.
That'd be ridiculously interesting. But speaking of ridiculously interesting, we're running a little short on time, so I do want to pass it over to a Q&A in case anyone has any questions. I'm not sure if there are any or many questions available, because it looks like we have quite a lively meetup, fortunately, so I'm really happy to see that. But I guess a general question is, Seneca, when would people be looking at availability and pricing?
So we're kind of easing our way into it. This is our first time making this product, which involves making tooling for almost every component. We have test molded everything, so I actually have the stabilizers and the switches in injection molded thermoplastics, but they're test molds, so I can only make a few hundred parts out of those. So this is this edition 0 that we're offering, actually starting on Monday, is it'll be kind of like, it's really for existing hardcore supporters of my work and enthusiasts who will be patient if it takes a long time. But the idea is we're taking these edition 0 orders on Monday, and it is our intent to ship around the end of the year, because we actually have to make a lot of tooling for all of the parts. And we're ready to pull the trigger on that very soon. But yeah, so we're just making 50 of this edition 0, and it's kind of for existing clients, and it's a very cautious beginning. Eventually, towards the end of this year and into the next, we'll start having wider availability. But again, the idea is we want to do things that are creatively interesting. So instead of just like always having a silver anodized aluminum one that you can just go and buy in the store, we want to do like smaller batches of interesting finishes. So we'll do like 20 in some new microarc oxidation finish. We'll do 20 in some unusual titanium oxide or something like that. And we'll just kind of, because they kind of take a long time to build. They're built, the final assembly steps happen all here in the US, and there's a lot of QC, and we do some tuning and testing, and it's a bit of a process. It's never meant to be a mass market product, and so it just takes a long time. So we kind of want to do it in a very slow and measured way. So we're kind of roll it out over time, because we want to make sure everybody has a good experience. And at any rate, that'll start happening early next year.
Wonderful, that's great to hear. It looks like we do have a question.
Yeah.
The question, yes, Ryan, where can people follow along about the progress of your work and learn more?
Yeah, so if you're interested in the technical stuff of the stabilizer, I gave a talk at KeyCon, and there's on Teja's YouTube channel, he just stuck a camera in front of me. It's not the most high production quality video, but it goes very deep into the technical aspects of that R&D project, right? If you find that interesting, I also have been doing a design journal on my personal newsletter, which is just ryan.norbauer.com. And so there's an even longer form technical deep dive into stabilizer development there in writing. It's literally 50,000 words, right? I know there's some people who will be interested in all of the twists and turns we took to get there, and so that's where I write the much more nerdy stuff, is on my personal newsletter. So if you just Googled my name, that would be the first thing that would come up. We also have a shop newsletter where I occasionally will cross-link to such things, but that's mostly for availability of products and stuff like that. If you're more interested in the nerdy things, as I would be, then I would check out my personal newsletter. We also have a YouTube channel, which I haven't used too much, but I'll probably occasionally start doing more. That talk that I did at KeyCon proved very, very popular. I don't know why it has a massive amount of views on YouTube. And it kind of I thought nobody would watch it. It's like an hour of the most arcane, technical, nerdy stuff. And it's like by far the most popular thing I've ever done on the internet. And so it kind of has emboldened me to lean into the nerdiness and keep producing longer form, deeper dive content like that, if that helps.
Do we have any other questions before we wrap up this segment for today, before proceeding with the rest of our itinerary? No, it looks like we're good on questions. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for coming today and talking with me about Seneca, Star Trek, and many other things.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And thanks to you, Huey, as always, for your continued involvement in organizing these events. I know how arduous it is. It's nice to see that you actually have some help this year, and it seems like it's running smoother than ever. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.